Hello, everyone, and welcome to those in the room and to those joining online. My name is Federica Cherubini, and I'm the Director of Leadership Programs at the Reuters Institute. And I'm very happy to be the moderator of the first panel this morning called Power, Profit, and Plurality in the Age of Generative AI. Before I introduce our speakers, and I see Klaudia also appearing on the screen. Hello, Klaudia. Let me take you back for a second and tell you a story that we all know very well, but I kind of want to recap very quickly. So the advent of the internet and the democratization of online participation changed the position in traditional news organizations have held in the past and rebalanced the power relationship between them and other actors. Which actors? Of course, the relationship between news organizations and the public, principally. News organization and what used to be the main source of revenue, advertisers. News organization and new entrants in the digital space, so distribution and big social platforms. News organizations and new other providers of news, whether it's non-traditional media, alternative media, influencers, creators. And because of the change in the landscape just mentioned, also between news organizations and those in powers. So think politicians in their ability to reach out to the public directly, but also more generally in government, and we'll see the impact on that on policy. So it's not a new story, right? We know the news organizations are no longer the gatekeepers of news. Now, back to today, and the advent of generative AI and the proliferation of large language models and AI companies adds to this disruption and sort of poses new challenges because it reopens the question about how this power dynamics between news organizations on one end and all these different actors are shaping up. Some of the companies that are more prominent in this relationship are companies we know well. They were there before, Google. Other are newer-ish, like OpenAI, but there are also new entrants like Perplexity and others. So in this panel today, we'll discuss these changing power dynamics between news organizations and some of these actors, with the view of trying to figure out how news organizations can maintain relevance, thinking about protecting intellectual property and secure revenue, ideally. We're not going to do it just with me, luckily. You have a fantastic panel of experts. So I'm joined by Andrew Strait, who till last week was the Associate Director of Emerging Tech at the Ada Lovelace Institute, but soon to be joining the UK AI Security Institute to lead their societal resilience workstream. Thank you so much for spending your day off in between jobs with us today. Matt Rogerson, Director of Global Public Policy and Platform Strategy at the Financial Times. Felix Simon, who's the Research Fellow at the Reuters Institute, and he works on our AI workstream. And joining online incredibly early from New York, we are very grateful, is Klaudia Jaźwińska as a researcher at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. So, now, if we go back to that idea of looking at the different relationship between news organizations and these actors, and we use this as a sort of like a lens of the generative AI to read these relationships, we said one of the first relationship to be disrupted or changed is between news organizations and the public. Felix will hear later from our colleague Richard and Amy more in details about what our research says. But can you take us very briefly through how has this relationship been impacted when it comes to AI and how are audiences thinking and feeling about the use of AI in news?
I mean, Federica already said some of these things, but I think, again, it's sort of useful to start with a quick reminder of how we got here. And I think in many ways, one interesting thing is that sort of in the 20th century, lots of news organizations, they sort of evolved into relatively independent institutions. They had significant political, cultural, and economic influence, largely due to their control over communications channels. And in many ways, this is, as you already said, has sort of changed with the advent of the internet, digital media, and then platforms who shifted this dynamic, capturing audience attention and basically becoming central gateways to news, but also sort of more broadly central gateways to information. I think in many ways that's sort of the first part of the equation. You have platform companies, tech industry, they have already and are increasingly controlling access to audiences. And publishers have found various ways already of dealing with this, from full-blown denial in some cases to collaboration to confrontation. That's sort of the history of sort of the last 20 years. I think in many ways it is, however, important to point out that platform companies have used this disruption of various markets, not just information, to also reinvest and build very extensive systems of compute, software, labor, organizational structures, which gave them, on the one hand, increasing returns to scale. And this is sort of also where AI comes into the mix for the first time. In many ways, the sort of data infrastructures, the infrastructures they've built, has given them the ability to collect more data, to process that data, and then make further strategic investments and acquisitions, especially in AI, which were used to complement their core businesses, driving further economies of scale and scope, and reinforcing this dominant position over the information environment in many ways, sort of precipitating the situation we have today. And I think it's from this position that they have largely dominated the development and application of AI, including for information. And in many ways, the fact that they now push generative AI systems is sort of the second part of that equation. It allows them to retain and extend control over the ordering of information, over access to information, and also audiences. And it helps them in serving those audiences as well as other clients, such as business and government, in various needs, as well as sort of providing this capability to other actors. And in many ways, to me, the situation we now see is that news organizations especially face two things. On the one hand, it's the extended competition from existing platforms, which have already disrupted their business models, the access to audiences. And they face extended competition from those very same companies for attention, things like AI search, new products that are being built on those platforms with the help of AI. But they also face competition from new and sometimes ultra low cost information providers who sort of specialize in the generation of content that serves some of the very same needs that audiences have. And in many ways, something we will hear about later today, especially from Matt, I think this sort of fight over publisher data is almost, I think, a sideshow in that context. And of course, the big question is, where does it leave audiences? AI products slowly alter how they can access information and news. And in many ways, how this affects publishers and news is one thing, but really how it affects public informedness, the way people can sort of inform themselves and serve their existing information needs, including for news, that is changing. And we have to say there remains quite a lot of research to be done, but I think what we see is a sort of early trends that audiences actually find a lot of those products appealing. Especially younger audiences report high uses of Gen AI systems, chatbots and the like in various countries. They are increasingly comfortable with AI for news and information. Again, as we will hear from our research and probably from people on the panel, it's still early days. There's still lots of fluctuation. There's lots of unknown variables in play. But I think it's important to remember that this sort of shift is happening, and just hoping that it will go away, because people will hopefully be deterred by this because they find it awful in some sense. I don't think that's a good strategy. And in many ways, that's sort of the theme we're seeing. It's increasing audience acceptance of those new technologies, despite the flaws they have. And that, in many ways, really sort of raises big questions for the way the information environment is structured and who has power and control in that context.
Absolutely. And this, of course, brings us to the conversation about AI companies themselves and what's the value exchange between news organizations and these AI companies, which we can see in sort of like in two ways. One way, as we were saying, is like seeing as distribution platforms, basically places where information is and audiences can access through it, but also most, basically deals and monetization of the content, and therefore that kind of value exchange. Klaudia, your recent research looked at how generative search tools cite news and the potential implications for publishers' agency over how their content is used. Can you take us through what have you found out?
Sure. First of all, good morning. Thank you very much for having me, and apologies if I come across as groggy at all. I'm normally not public speaking at this hour in the US. For a little bit of context, I lead the flagship project at the Tau Center, which is called Platforms and Publishers, and it's been underway for about a decade and examines Silicon Valley's impact on the news industry. And last year, my colleague Pete Brown and I conducted 34 interviews with representatives from newsrooms and technology companies for a report on the impact of AI's impact on for a report on the topic of AI's impact on the journalism industry. And one of the themes that kept coming up during our interviews with news publishers was a concern about the potential implications that the rise of third-party summarization products, such as AI chatbots, could have for the news industry. And they raised concerns about topics such as media plurality. So what happens when users rely upon generative search or generative AI as the single source of truth? What happens to brand integrity when publishers lose control over how their content is remixed by large language models and the context in which it is presented, brand dilution, so publishers not getting adequate credit for their content, as well as implications for audience engagement. So publishers were worried that the tools are likely to reduce the flow of traffic to their owned and operated platforms, and their ability to directly engage with their audiences. And of course, another major concern was the value exchange between AI companies and news publishers who are developing the content that those models greatly rely upon. And as we know, some publishers have had the opportunity to work out deals with AI companies, but that option is not available to most of the news industry. So based on that context, earlier this month, my colleague Aishwarya Chandrasekhar and I published quantitative research that tested the ability of generative search tools or chatbots that have real-time search capability to accurately cite the sources of news-related content. And one of the purposes of this research was to see whether the levers that news publishers are told they have when it comes to whether or not their content is used by AI systems actually work. And we thought this was worth exploring given the popularity, as Felix mentioned, of these tools and the way in which they rely on news content to be able to provide up-to-date answers to user queries. So for this experiment, we selected 20 different publishers in the US with various types of relationships to AI companies. So some of those publishers had direct content licensing or revenue share agreements with AI companies. Some of the publishers had lawsuits against them. Some did not have a formal relationship but permitted their web crawlers, and some did not permit their crawlers. And for each publisher, we found 10 random articles and we selected excerpts from those articles. And then we asked 8 different chatbots, 8 of the most popular chatbots, which included ChatGPT, Perplexity, Copilot, DeepSeek, to identify the original article that those excerpts came from, which is something that Google can do with ease. You can paste a quote and you can find, most of the time, you can find the source. And in total, we ran 1,600 queries. And our expectation was that the chatbots would be able to correctly identify the excerpts from publishers whose content they had access to, and that they would be unable to identify content from publishers who block their crawlers. But this was not the case. Some of the things we found were that chatbots often answered queries in a way that was confidently wrong. So rather than declining to answer a question when they couldn't access that content, they just offered incorrect or speculative answers. We also were surprised to find that premium models, ones that cost more money, such as Perplexity Pro and Grok 3, which is the newest version of Elon Musk's AI model, provided more confidently wrong answers than their free counterparts, which means that they had a tendency to provide definitive but wrong answers rather than declining entirely. And we also found that some platforms seem to retrieve information from publishers that had intentionally blocked their crawlers via the robot exclusion protocol. So they were able to correctly answer questions about publishers that they shouldn't have had access to. For example, National Geographic blocks Perplexity's web crawler, but Perplexity was able to correctly identify 9 out of the 10 excerpts from the publisher. We also found that generative search tools often link to fabricated links or syndicated or copied versions of articles. Gemini and Grok were the worst offenders in this, so the response would often seem like they were able to identify the excerpt, but when you clicked on the URL that they included in the answer, it led to a 404 error page because the URL was hallucinated. And we also found that content licensing deals appear to give no guarantee of accurate citation in chatbot responses. So, for example, the San Francisco Chronicle is owned by Hearst and has a content licensing deal with OpenAI, and yet ChatGPT was not able to identify most of the excerpts that we shared with the chatbot from the Chronicle. These findings suggest that there is much to be desired in terms of how AI tools present news content, and that news publishers don't appear to have very much say in the matter as of right now. And given that search is a major source of discovery for a lot of news organizations and that search behavior is rapidly trending towards AI tools, this can have serious ramifications for the journalism industry.
Thank you so much, Klaudia. This is a very useful overview. Matt, can I bring you in from the publisher's perspective at this point? Where is this value exchange and how should we look at it?
The products aren't great, clearly, at the moment. I mean, I think that's quite clear from Claudia's research. And we run our own internal research on the way in which our content is treated by some of the near AGI tools that are currently out in the market at the moment. And we find similar things. I think we find a lot of chatbots that get to paywalls, quote content, and then hallucinate beyond the paywall. And for a publisher like the FT, Financial Times, so our journalism is used by people to make decisions about what stocks and shares to invest in. If you're using one of these tools and it's giving you incorrect stocks and shares, or it's giving you perspectives from trusted columnists that are completely fabricated, that's quite problematic, I would think, and possibly something that the FCA or other financial regulator might want to look at. We find similar things with pharma reporting, so stuff on drugs. So it's not in a good place, I would say, at the moment, these products. We want the first publisher to do a licensing agreement with OpenAI for training and inference. And that's really positive that we were able to do that. I think AI models themselves, in the context of empowering users with information, can be incredibly powerful. The more and more I kind of speak to people who work in the industry, they think that kind of small models on devices that retrieve information in ways where the content owner owns the policy by which the information is retrieved, like the length of citation, the actual accurateness of the citation, the linking, extremely positive. I think the problem at the moment is information retrieval is being done to source publications and not in a way which is kind of like regulated in any way. And I think plurality has been mentioned a couple of times. And the point I would make is I think we're coming into this really, really woefully underprepared as a democracy and as a media ecosystem. So I mean, like, I've worked for the FT for 6 months. I worked for The Guardian 11 years before that. I've seen quite a lot of change. But I've also seen quite a lot of reports in Parliament talking about the need for greater visibility on things like plurality of sources on social media platforms or within news aggregation platforms. Nothing's happened. So nothing has happened. This government, when it came into power, the first thing it did from a DCMS perspective was talk about new measures around the consolidation of online magazines. And it's like so irrelevant from the reality of the problems that the news industry faces today. It's sort of almost a joke. I think then in the other part of this is obviously the scraping of data. And there again, we are woefully underprepared from a data protection perspective. We saw a few years ago that Meta platforms were scraped by Bright Data, taking millions and millions of accounts information from that platform. I agree with Meta at this point, which is quite rare for me, but they call for more action by governments, for more powers to enable them to stop scraping by anonymous sources. Nothing's happened. There's a bit of legislation before Parliament at the moment, the Data Access Bill, where there have been suggestions around transparency of scrapers. Separately, the ICO has written to the government around the copyright consultation and said that it thinks transparency of scraping is urgently needed. It remains to be seen whether the government will do anything, but it needs to happen tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Andrew, can I bring you in from your perspective? What have you seen in your work? Of course, you work on emerging tech, and now is AI, but before was another emerging, was other emerging tech. What's your perspective on this issue about the value exchange? How should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks everyone for being on vacation with me right now. It's great to have you here. Maybe it's helpful to share a bit of sort of like why ADA came to this topic in the first place, because our work at ADA for the last 5 years, the team I was leading, was studying the emerging impacts the impacts of emerging technologies on different people in society. And this included working with BBC early days about how they are using AI in the newsroom and their internal responsibility practices. But starting in 2023, we started to get this very funny thing happening where news publishers were reaching out to us asking, hey, what's the value of our training data? I'm just curious about this. My background is I used to, for my sins, work in the tech industry. I used to work for Google and DeepMind for about 10 years on ethics and policy teams and content moderation teams. I was helping build and design some of these systems more from like the ethical societal impact side and trying to advise teams on like what those impacts might be. So this topic is something that weirdly we called in sort of 2017. We are seeing it come to fruition now in terms of its impacts on news ecosystems and the information ecosystem writ large. Why should we care about this? Well, we've just published a survey this week, as of today, which confirms once again, I think something we all know, which is that the British public are using these tools. 61% of the British public described having heard of LLMs and LLM-based products. 40% of them, particularly younger users, much higher, are already using this. The number one reason they're using it, 2/3 said, for answering information and finding out recommendations about the world around them. So that's, again, a sudden and significant shift from just 2 years when these products did not exist. I think it is, again, a sign that we are seeing something that's replacing traditional search engines and forms of information in a way that I think is very different from what search offered. Just to kind of talk a bit about the technology for a minute, it's important that we acknowledge these are not tools that are deterministic, that are designed to give a single answer if you query the same thing 1,000 times. By their structure, by design, they are stochastic and probabilistic. That means that if you query it 100 times, it's going to give you 100 slightly different versions of the same thing. Now, there's bells and whistles that you can put in as a tech company, like caching and other kinds of things to give stock answers. But that is kind of a way to like placate some of these obvious use cases. A good example is like medical information. 7% of all Google searches are for medical information, many times in urgent cases. If we are using these tools, in cases like Gemini, you ideally want to be directing people towards like accurate information from the NHS. That is now much harder to do and control when you talk about stochastic, probabilistic systems for finding information. So what's the things that kind of brought us to news publishers? Well, off the back of these conversations with news publishers, we started to talk with them. We had a workshop with our colleagues at the Bridging Responsibility AI Divide program at Edinburgh, Amanda Horschik, Bronwyn Jones, and Britannia Parnell. And one of the things that we talked with them about was just, what are you seeing? What's going on with these data deals? What kinds of issues are you coming into or finding in those situations? And I think what we're seeing is deals that are kind of taking three forms. One is deals for training or fine-tuning data. So this is just, can you give us access to all of your data, historical and going forward, that we can use for training large language models? These models are very data hungry. News information and news data is very desirable because it is high quality, it's edited, it's factual, it's not like Reddit data. The goal of this data is to try to create, have these systems create the morphology of language, so the way in which they sort of can describe or write in very kind of academic or believable, credible ways. News information is a great way to do that. But it's not kind of the golden goose. It's not the thing that these companies really want that access for. And that kind of leads to the second type of data deal, which is for inference access. That's when you're allowed to pull this information from news sites live in a search query or a ChatGPT results connect to the internet. And that's kind of what the Perplexity deals with Der Spiegel are doing with this kind of ad revenue sharing program. It's what the News Corp OpenAI 5-year deal is doing. It's trying to get access to this information to pull in live. The third type of deal is essentially one that covers all three, or first two. Why is this important? It's very important because it raises many different issues. One is you have huge limited financial benefits. Limited financial benefits, not huge, the opposite of huge. Limited financial benefits for companies. Particularly for training data, you're offering a sort of one-time value for the tech company on a deal that's going to expire, and after that point, it kind of loses its value. What they need is the totality of all the data that's come before to train a model. They don't really need stuff that's new because the morphology, this sort of style of the language probably is going to be the same. And so this is kind of this weird situation where news companies are signing deals. It's like a 5-year deal of this information, but after 5 years, I doubt they'll be renewed because they don't need that information for training as much as they once did. They will need it for inference. And this is where I think it gets to another issue, which is the problem of this kind of power asymmetry negotiations. There's a lot of issues and a lot of fragmentation in the news industry at the moment, where different news publishers don't want to be left behind. They're seeing this as the Facebook moment. They're seeing this as the social media moment, where they think, if we don't sign that deal first to get our information in Perplexity and Google Gemini, then others will, and we will be left out. And that is very much the negotiating tactic these companies are going into these deals with. It creates this kind of sense of FOMO, of moving very quickly. It means that in these negotiations, we heard many news publishers describing they didn't feel very adequately prepared for what to sort of talk about or how their data would be used. As Klaudia and others have raised, I think this point of attribution issues, of quality issues, is a really hard one both to protect against in those deals, but crucially, even if you do build in protections, to enforce it. Enforcement is a huge problem in this kind of new trajectory, because we don't have very good tools for assessing where someone might be violating a particular agreement, or how often attribution issues are arising. I'll just end with one final thing before of the doom, I guess, side of this conversation that we heard from these news publishers, which was just to draw in, very similar to Claudia's work, some of the brilliant work the BBC R&D team have been doing, where they found that in a very similar type of experiment with Perplexity, Gemini, other types of systems, you had over 51% had some kind of significant error in results. You had 90% had factual errors, and 13% of responses had quotes that were either completely made up or seriously altered. And again, if we think about the scale of how many people are currently today using these systems for this kind of information gathering, that is a significant change in the quality and reliability of news information at a very crucial time in our current geopolitical moment. So I just want to kind of end on the doom. We'll probably come to the good things and ways forward after this. But yes, it's a very challenging and sudden problem for news publishers worldwide.
I promise I will ask about, are there opportunities there? But before we get to the opportunities, Felix, you've looked at some of the different deals. Well, we don't know much about many of the deals, because many are, of course, covered by NDAs and by, they are private for each companies. But you've been, and as we've been, mentioning, often the deals have happened with bigger companies and bigger news publishers, and not many of the smaller publishers, and not often in languages that are not English. You've looked a bit of how we should think about some of these from a research perspective, or the questions behind these deals. What have you been finding out?
I mean, in many ways, it sort of draws on some of the conversations Andrew and Matt mentioned. I was also kindly invited to the very same event organized with Braid. And I think that the sort of thing I've sort of realized in many ways, it's completely understandable that there is this sort of secrecy around those AI licensing deals. I mean, there's commercial interests at stake. So it makes sense. I can see why it's secret. I can see why both publishers and AI developers don't want to disclose the details. But in many ways, it sort of creates a big collective action problem for all players involved in a weird way, not just developers, publishers, but also wider societies and regulators and beyond that. In many ways, we have absolutely no idea what the value of that data is. It's very difficult to sort of independently assess it. Of course, we can ask economists to build sort of models, and I think they will be probably more or less sort of accurate in some shape or form, but without actually knowing anything about what's going on in those deals negotiations, it's quite hard for regulators to sort of give any advice, guidance, or do proper regulation. But it's also difficult for both other news companies who might want to strike deals to assess if they're effectively being pulled over the barrel. But the same is also true for AI companies, because there's quite a lot of companies that are not OpenAI, they're not Perplexity, they're not sort of big venture capitalist-backed organizations who can afford big sort of legal teams to think about those questions. There's lots of smaller players who we might want, from an innovation perspective, to be able to get access to data in a legal way, and in a way that actually respects the rights of content creators. But we have no idea if the terms they're being offered by the content creators, especially if we talk about a publisher, if that is actually fair in any way. So in many ways, this sort of lack of transparency really is a problem. And it's not clear to me at the moment how we can sort of find a way around this where there is more openness, because some people know this, some people have the answer. One's probably next to me, and they cannot talk about for
the answers.
and they cannot talk about it for a good reason. But I think from an outsider point of view, from someone who looks at this from a research perspective, it creates problems, and we have to think about it collectively, because otherwise I think proper regulation and proper negotiation is much harder to come by.
Matt, it looked like you wanted to add something.
Well, I'll make a couple of observations. One is, I think if you look at the folks who've actually done licensing deals, fundamentally, the ones that have done deals in any volume or agreements in any volume is OpenAI. And the reason for that is that they haven't already scraped and gathered all of the data that they need to build their model for a primary purpose. So if you look at Microsoft or Google, they've already got all the world's data because they're search engines. So OpenAI hasn't got that, and it's sort of like a soulless player. So it's like building this product. So it needs to make sure that those agreements are in place in order to develop those products. Those are the biggest companies who have the most power and who have the ability to say to governments, if you don't water down copyright, we're not going to build a data center. They're not doing licensing agreements to the same degree as sort of soulless players that aren't building data centers. Second thing is, I'm more optimistic around the transparency point, and I would say that because I work for a news organisation. But we've seen examples where agreements have been forged around licensing, for example, in Australia. The News Media Bargaining Code in Australia involved the regulator being involved in discussions between platforms and publishers. And the regulator in that instance knew the value of agreements between platforms and publishers. And what they were able to do was stand in the middle and look at the agreements between platforms and groups of smaller publishers. So groups of smaller publishers in Australia were able to strike licensing deals with those very, very large platforms that came within the scope of the code. Similarly, regulators in the UK know the value of AI agreements that have been struck by UK publishers because they're doing investigations at the moment around search and AI. So the people who need to know, and it's in a black box, and they can look at actually, are the agreements being offered to smaller publishers or other publishers, are they fair and equitable? The challenge that we've got is, and I come back to the data center point, the level of power that I think those companies have got over the government now is quite astonishing. Like, those companies are now arguing to the White House that copyright should basically not exist, otherwise China will win, right? It's like, in another world, you know, would you say bring in a shipment of Burberry handbags that is set off the coast from China? No, you prevent them from getting market access. So there are ways to kind of stop Chinese models getting access to the US market. But I think the power of those companies to now say, we're not going to invest in the UK, we're not going to bring chips to the UK, we're not going to invest in data centers in the UK, we're not going to release models in the UK, that is what politicians are worried about. Now, I think that concern is probably misplaced. I think you can do a lot with AI without the sort of models that those companies are pushing. But that is the message that they're delivering to ministers, which is you need us to secure your economic and national security future.
Klaudia, you actually published something recently, probably just the other day, on this topic, looking at some of the efforts that some companies are doing, like are putting, as Matt was saying, pressuring the Trump administration on copyright. Can you tell us what you found?
Yeah, so in January, one of the first things that Trump did when he entered office was he put out an executive order that nullified Joe Biden's previous executive order on AI. And one of the stipulations of this executive order was to establish an AI action plan. And there was a call for comment recently, and both Google and OpenAI submitted comments in which they basically called on the government to weaken copyright restrictions on AI training and to codify a right for US AI companies to train their models on publicly available data largely without restriction. And OpenAI kind of tried to use the AI war model, and they talked about China being worried that because DeepSeek is, owned by the CCP or the CCP has influence over DeepSeek, that, there's so much competition there, and if we don't keep up and we don't, or if AI companies don't have unrestricted access to data, that the US will fall behind. And I imagine that especially publishers who have licensing agreements with a company like OpenAI might have been very surprised to hear that OpenAI is trying to get out of that and trying to get that data for free.
Thank you so much. When Richard, my colleague Richard, mentioned at the beginning that we've asked some of the questions around AI, both from an audience perspective, but also to publishers in some of our research. Earlier this year, we published a trends and prediction report, which is based on an audience survey with news publishers, with news leaders, so representing news publishers. And we asked them to put aside their own company situation for a moment, but generally speaking, from a leadership perspective of news companies, what was their preferred approach to licensing deals? And incredibly, 72% say that they would really want to go for collective agreements. Yet, I'm not aware of any collective agreement at the moment. While we brought in the question around copyright and regulation, Matt, how should you work on copyright frameworks? How should we be thinking about this? Do you see a collective agreement that has 72% of newsroom leaders wish?
I think, well, I would say, so the news industry has always had a couple of big problems. One is we're all hyper competitive, so the desire to work together is limited.
I was also a bit confused about the results of that question.
But then I would also say, like, the limits of competition law mean that you also can't work together in any meaningful way because that would fall foul of competition law. So actually working out what are the basis on which you can work together to create a new world it's tough to know, really. Tough to work that out. But what I would say is I think there is an appetite amongst different news organisations in the UK who have a kind of global footprint to actually work together to try and solve these problems in a more productive way. And actually the regulatory environment plays to this, because if you look at, if they're allowed to do their work, we don't know whether that's the case at the moment. Regulators in the US and regulators in the UK and in Europe are looking at how do you open up ecosystems that are currently extremely sticky for consumers to enable other offerings within that context. So, for example, could you open up the Google News vertical in the Google News ecosystem to enable users to switch to a different provider of news content, or could you open up the kind of LLMs in a way which would mean that other forms of inference that were potentially collective forms of inference could be used rather than ones that are determined by the ecosystem owners themselves? So I think there's a real opportunity there for the industry to step forward with collective solutions. I think there is definitely a tension between that and the desire to do a kind of big bilateral agreement, and certainly our preference is kind of those bilateral agreements to date. The question, I think some of us were at a conference recently where we were talking about kind of AI agents and all that jazz, and I think that question about actually if you move away from centralized environments that are owned by one or two tech companies, and instead the agent acts on your behalf, and the agent has kind of like has access to paywall content, and it can reverse that paywall content and bring in content from those news providers that and the news provider gets paid and the consumer gets access to reliable and excellent quality information. That's really exciting because you're decentralizing the power away from the kind of ecosystem owners that we have today. And I think that's where we sort of as an industry need to be thinking about how do we get there as much as we are thinking about kind of the world as it is at the moment.
Andrew, of course, your perspective, you've been working with publishers, but it's not on a behalf of a publisher. How has Ada been looking at this framework of regulation and policy when thinking about answering some of these questions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have been thinking about regulation in the perspectives of how, with copyright, thinking about what copyright is good for and not great for. And there are some kinds of issues that this technology is raising that it seems like copyright just isn't well suited for. So things like right to likeness issues and the way in which systems, particularly like video generation, image generation, the risk is not so much that you're like having a copyrighted image of you that's being recreated, it's that like literally you lose control of your self-image. So that's, again, just a question here for governments of like what kinds of new laws, regulations, social innovations do we need to come with this technological innovation? That's one key challenge. With copyright specifically in news publishers, I think the challenge here is, again, what's the type of risk that you're concerned with? And I was very happy to see in the consultation, I think it was the second to last question, that they were like, what is this retrieval augmented generation inference thing that we've heard some things about? That's wonderful to see government at least asking this question, because it's part of the debate that I think gets missed quite a lot. I can feel you're like, oh my God, like about the risks of inference, the way in which these technologies, it's not, again, so much a copyright concern as an attribution and accuracy issue that these technologies raise. Copyright's a part of it, but it's not the kind of core piece. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, remiss of me to say, remiss of me. I mean, in terms of the government consultation, we don't think that an opt-out would work, because actually finding the people that are scraping your content is incredibly difficult. They don't identify themselves, they compose as subscribers and then take content and then sell it to a Perplexity or someone like that. So we don't think that approach would work. I think I was a bit more annoyed about how much of a lack of, it was like, oh, and we've heard of this RAG thing. What is this? And it's like, no, that's everything. Like that is what's happening at the moment, is these kind of paid for AI search engines are basically scraping live information. And if they don't have that live information, they're about as useful as a brick. You know, they will just hallucinate perpetually. That's what they're designed to do. So actually working out how do we develop a RAG market is incredibly important. And what you're seeing at the moment is we have kind of like 2 or 3 options for developers to use. Google have got a RAG product, which you can actually opt out of. You cannot opt out of that one if you want to through extended controls. Microsoft has a RAG product. They're both at the same price. And then you've got Brave, which provides a RAG product. And you can find ways to block that, though you can't opt out of the Brave product through robots.txt. So actually working out what the share of value from those sort of products is, and actually pricing it in a meaningful way, that will be key, I think, to making this commercially sustainable.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Maybe I should try to clarify. I'm also involved in my data hat with like some of the European copyright consultations. They're not asking about RAG, so it's nice to see the UK is at least asking the question in a very, what I think very productive way. Yeah. But you're right. It's a long ways to go. I mean, it requires, I think, a whole suite of innovative solutions that governments have not really put forward yet. I think it also comes to this question in my mind. I think we at ADA also agreed that an opt-out solution is not going to work. The consultation is premised on an opt-out solution if technical mitigation measures can exist. And it's very clear that these do not exist currently, and extremely unlikely they ever could. They're very easily overridable. The current ones, like robot.txt, which just block web crawling, not even scraping, already are very easy to be bypassed and very hard to enforce. So it gets into a question of what other technical solutions might there be. So things like for access to training data, there are other technical solutions that are beginning to come forward. One is something that this organization OpenMind have been very much pioneering, this idea of secure multi-party computation, where someone can access and train a model on your data without ever having the data leave your platform and leave a secure device, and without you, the data holder, ever really knowing what they're training, what they're actually using it for. It's very compute intensive, but again, more innovation in that space could make this more cost efficient, could reduce the issues of some of the loss of control of this data that many news publishers are concerned with. It's not solving the RAG issue. The second thing I would just say is I think underneath legislation and regulation, we need to ask a basic question, which is, what is the cost value benefit of things like copyright reform for the current generation of products that are being built? I think we are stuck in this paradigm. It's not very helpful right now, where we're being told that we are going to have an artificial general intelligence, systems that are good at every task humans can do. They are going to be the everything system. They're going to do your taxes. They're going to book your laundry. They're going to personally drive your car and know all your preferences in this wonderful, beautiful universe. They will soon be agents taking actions in the real world. That's not what the technology is now. I speak as someone who, I'm not a computer scientist, but I certainly know quite a few. And if you talk to folks inside, that's not what they think they're building. There's so many major paradigm shifting jumps we need to get to before we get to that point. And the way that AGI is being talked about, both in kind of the sort of press and the marketing materials, and even at the moment in some governments, is unfortunately, I think, premise this idea that everything will be worth it in the end. I think that is a really important thing to challenge and to raise a question about. And this gets back to the point that Karsten Young at IPPR has made, which is about what we really need is directional innovation. We need innovation that's moving towards very specific products that have a very clear value add for society, for people, for certain communities. Not this kind of everything system that could be, like it's an open signifier. It could be like the worst thing in the world, or it could be the best thing in the world, depending on what you want it to be. That is, I think, a challenge that we're currently in right now when we talk about what kind of regulation is needed and necessary, because you can't argue about the needs of news publishers if you're countering the opposite is like it's going to solve cancer and the climate emergency and it's going to be amazing at booking your travel. Like that's a really hard position for you guys to be in. There are organizations that are doing this, and that's a lot of what Ada was doing, was just trying to challenge, like, what is actually happening with these tools? What are they good at? We're not alone. There's other organizations out there, but I would just stress, don't take the debate at that starting point. I think that's a very bad and unfavorable starting point to begin with. It's one that's currently captured the moment, but one that is very easy to knock down as soon as you start to look at the ways in which systems just, can't do very basic types of reasoning that humans are capable of, and nonetheless being deployed in contexts where that is essential to get right. The more we talk to organizations that are deploying these tools, this is the thing that I would wish more of these organizations in the industry would speak up about, is that they don't actually find them that helpful for most tasks. They're great for tasks where the way you get to the end point, like coding, doesn't really matter. It's kind of like just, is it verifiably true and accurate? Tasks where the truth doesn't really matter, or tasks where getting something wrong, the stakes are so low, it doesn't really matter that much. But that's not how most tasks that we care about and that we need in businesses work, right? How you get there, explaining how you get there, showing how you get there is crucial, particularly as journalists. I think I'm kind of moving us more into like how newsrooms are talking about using AI. But to me, that's a really important challenge, I think, again, as publishers and news organizations to think about as you're starting to use these tools in your day-to-day.
Yeah, I agree with all that. But don't you think it's even bigger, which is, to my point about we haven't really got a sense of, as a society, what we think like a good media ecosystem looks like. We just I would say the last 15 years, it's just sort of degraded before our eyes because platform innovation has kind of happened. And, if you look back to the 2003 Communications Act, that feels very distant now from where we are. And to my point earlier, the idea we're sort of like talking about plurality of online magazines when there are sort of really existential questions here. There isn't really any leadership within government on this or kind of sense of what a good media ecosystem looks like. And that means that you can't then judge the impact of these technologies against kind of a vision of what that is. And that's hugely problematic.
I'll just quickly say this, which is when we talk to people, we do a lot of public engagement at Ada. This is a core part of our work. We talk to people in every project about what their concerns, hopes, dreams of AI are. We're about to publish a peer research study that's looking at 3 different sites, Sheffield, Belfast, and London, where we just had people go into their communities and ask them what they think about AI and what they're concerned about. And the biggest thing that people say in those workshops is news and information. They feel like the world is becoming harder to understand, that it's becoming faster and more fast-paced, and they're losing the ability to get access to good information and crucially the ability to be heard. Yeah. So that, I think, does to me suggest there is actually some kind of vision of what people want out of a media ecosystem. It's just about sort of shaping that vision as leaders into what that looks like. Very hard to do. I'm not a journalist. I don't work in these organizations. Sounds like you guys hate each other. But if you can find a way.
No, we love each other. We love each other. We're just not allowed to work together. That's fine.
Yeah, I think there's something to tap into there, what people want out of news, which hasn't changed. I think there's a misperception that, people are just being duped into, AI slop and they love what's happening online. I actually don't think that's true at all from when we talk to people. They just feel like they're compelled to use these platforms in many cases because that's where their social networks are. It's the thing that they're locked into and there aren't other alternatives. Yeah. So I think if we can offer an alternative, that would go a long way.
I want to make sure I have time for a question from the audience here, and I will read you the poll that we've been running for those on Zoom. But before I do that, that sort of like brings me back to sort of like the beginning of the conversation, right? So we look at like the technology aspect, but of course there is a societal aspect and an audience aspect, and we'll hear from some of our own research on audiences and how they think about how to use generative AI, and in exactly as you were saying, like for health, for entertainment, for what task. And I was actually wondering, and I would like to a very quick sort of like round from all of you. Are we back to where we were at the beginning of the relationship with, let's call it the old social platforms like Facebook and Twitter of the beginning? In his book, The Power of Platforms, Rasmus Nielsen with Sarah Ganter look at this relationship and what they call like a platform publishing, right? So the fact that news organizations the ecosystem is so mediated by the platforms, then each organization needs to make a decision whether to be on the platform or not, because often that's the place where audiences are, right? So the book says there are no platform opportunities without platform risk, and each of the publisher might choose or had chosen in the past, do you want to be on Facebook or not? Do you want to be on Twitter or X or not, etc. Are we back at the same kind of relationship we had with the old platform, and now we're opening up with AI companies? Of course, everything is a trade-off. And what have we learned from that, Klaudia?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is expectation setting. I think one of the things we talked about at the beginning of this panel is this trend towards using new generative search technologies. And I think this is being presented as a continuation of what has existed in the past. Like, this is just a new way to do search. But in fact, there's a lot of limitations to large language models and to generative search tools right now that I don't think are sufficiently clear to users. And so if someone's just going from like Googling things to now asking ChatGPT or Perplexity the same sorts of questions, I don't think they realize the difference in doing that and how information is accessed differently, and the potential risks in having like a unitary summary of news or whatever other information sources, instead of the ability to see 10 different links and to click through and actually confirm whether the information you're being presented is what you think it is. And one thing that I think would be really valuable to audiences is for those chatbots to incorporate into their design some signal of, for example, their confidence in a given answer, or if they are unable to access certain information, to let the audience know, instead of just trying to please the user and offer them information when that information might not exist. And so I would say it's a continuation, but I think there's a lot of implications for audiences assuming that things are the same, or sorry, I'm not articulating this well, but I think it almost seems like the transition is a little bit too clean, and it would be helpful to establish more digital literacy on the user side, but also encourage or enforce greater transparency from the AI company side.
Felix, what do you think?
Just briefly, I think in terms of when we think about the relationship between publishers and those platforms, I think we've never left that sort of situation. It's just sort of exacerbation, continuation in the sort of dealings with these, and now it's sort of focus and seen through the lens of AI. But in many ways, we sort of see continuation of that. I think the other thing, and sort of Andrew touched upon this, is this sort of plays out, and it's very important to us because we think about this from various sort of ends, because we're all sort of involved in that, from the tech side, from the regulator side, from the research side, from the publisher side. But ultimately, I think Andrew sort of said, like, there's a bigger sort of fight playing out where a lot of these companies and governments, they have quite different issues on their minds and new sort of features in there, but it's not really it doesn't really play a big role. It's usually sort of like, oh yeah, we probably also have to think about that at some point, yada, yada, yada. But the big thing is sort of security. It's driving growth. It's these sort of magical promises that we sort of get from the people developing those systems. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind, because it will shape the way news and information, access to information, what audiences sort of get, to Claudia's point, that will be shaped by that broader dynamic. And we're sometimes a bit too insular of looking at our own little pond without considering the bigger implications.
Feels we've been there before. Matt, what do you think? What have we learned from the relationship with some of the, still very relevant, of course, social platforms, and how are we taking that to the relationship with the AI companies?
Yeah, so I would agree with Felix, really. I don't think there was ever a point when this wasn't a consideration. Like, I remember one of the last things we were looking at when I was at The Guardian was whether we should join Apple News, and the degree to which you could see about the substitution risk of Apple News versus not joining, effectively, and what are the kind of like smoke signals that you've got to go off to say, actually, you've got a problem here, that is becoming substitutional for going to the site itself. I do agree. I think this whole debate has become really, I think, deliberately clouded by vast questions about economic growth and national security. And I keep coming back to, as citizens, as consumers, as investors, you need information to enable you to make good decisions. And in a democracy, you need information to vote, and vote in a way which is sort of delivers good outcomes, I suppose. So what we own in that context, I've seen research saying that a free press in a democracy is worth 1% to 2% of GDP. It's very hard to quantify it. Someone's tried. They've claimed it's 1% to 2% of GDP. I'll go with that because that beats most GDP forecasts for any AI technology that's going to be integrated into an economy. But I think actually we've become quite, and I think it is because of the context we're living through, we've become quite bashful about the role and value of news in a democracy. And we need to be a bit more assertive about that.
Andrew, how do you see it from your point of view?
Yeah, I think a wise scholar once said, "Time is a flat circle," and I think he's probably right about this one too. I think some things are different, some things are new, the same. What feels the same is I think we have the same actors in this time around, which in a way is to a point of Claudia's making. I think there does seem to be a bit of continuation there. The kind of way in which they're messaging this, the kind of existing market power they can leverage in these negotiations does feel very similar to what they might have had last time around. It feels different, I think, is that you've been through this once before. So these promises of, this will, I think, early days Facebook and early days Google, that it'll actually grow your profits as news publishers rather than shrink, I think we can treat with a bit more suspicion and come with a bit of clear eyes about what's actually taking place. I think what is also different is that we're talking about a future of the technology that is not about connecting people in online digital spaces for all the positive and negative signs or things that can bring. It is increasingly moving us more into a single interpersonal relationship with a machine. Just trying to both simulate in a kind of closed window how you understand the world, how you understand yourself, and also what kinds of actions you want to take onto the world. The more you would delegate responsibility onto this. We've done a paper just now looking at the ways in which AI assistants are becoming more advanced. That's kind of the goal. It's not about connection, and apart from the sense that you are connected to a machine. Now, I will put my hand up and say I'm not someone who's a deep pessimist about some of these things. I want us to not sort of get into the very bad framing of Luddism, which unfortunately kind of predominates, which is this idea that we should reject all technology. That's not what Luddism is, right? Luddism is just being about critical of the technologies that we get in and asking what value is this actually giving us, and is it worth it? And I think that's where I do see a lot of optimism and hope. As bad as the framing around national security and around the kind of everything agent is right now and how powerful a driver that is, I think we live in a pluralistic society where we can also point out places where this is creating very unfavorable trade-offs, where the benefit isn't actually very clear at all and we should not assume it, and where the harm is immediate and very clear. And I do think that in this case, news information ecosystems, it's one that, 10 years ago, if you asked the public what they think about disinformation, they probably would have no idea what you're talking about. Now, this is the number one issue when people think about AI. I think that's very different. I think that gives you much more power than you might think to go into these negotiation conversations with your various stakeholders and think about how can we make that kind of a central point. So I'm trying to end on a positive note here for you all. I just wanna say you're stronger than you think, and you can do this.
I know we are at time, but Matt, you wanted to add one thing?
There's something vaguely clever I was going to say, but it was that the difference is the sort of social contract of the open web was, I'll get you from here to there, and you can do what you want with that person's attention. I don't think we've got enough clarity at the moment on where AI-powered search engines are going in terms of the delivery of that user to the source. Like, if you look at results for some of these very large companies, they say things like, engagement is up, use of these tools is up. But then you go, okay, what does that mean for actually the source of the content that's being consumed? And actually, when you run tests on it, which a company called Miso.ai have done, the click-through rates for those AI search engines is down to about 5%, which is very, very low compared to current state platform publisher relations. So the currency is changing. And actually, when the currency changes, the kind of social contract changes. And that is why I think publishers are looking at licensing arrangements, because they know the social contract is changing beneath their feet.
I did say there was a question from the public, but I don't have the time to do that, and I do apologize to the audience in person. But for those who have joined on Zoom, we have run a poll, which you might have seen on the screen before. We asked them, do you feel broadly positive or negative about the relationship between technology companies and news publishers? It's a split here. 39% says negative, 35% says neither positive or negative, and 27% says positive. So the jury is still out. But thank you so much to our fantastic panelists for joining us in this discussion, in person or online, waking up very early. We appreciate that, Klaudia. Thank you very much. More to discuss in the rest of the day, but join me to round of applause to our fantastic panelists.